Hey, and welcome to Matt and Jess TV. I am Matt Roast.
And I'm Jessica Bun Bun.
This is our Severance Season 2, Episode 4 reaction and review. This is an episode titled Woe's Hollow that even from like the opening minutes, you probably were able to sit back and be like, oh, this is very different than anything I have ever seen on this show before.
Yeah, this is a bottle episode where everything is just kind of happening in this one space. And I've always been very mixed about bottle episodes. I either really love them, like Breaking Bad and The Fly, and this episode, which I think is better than the Breaking Bad episode with The Fly. This is the best episode of the entire show for me.
Wow.
Or bottle episodes can be really frustrating. And, you know, we'll have an example of The Walking Dead. If you guys remember the episode where it looked like Glenn, there's no way he was going to get out of this situation. He was like underneath this like container and walkers were all around him. And it was like, this is it. There is no way he's getting out of this. And then the next episode was a bottle episode about Morgan. And it was a really good episode, but the timing of it was so poor that nobody liked it. Everybody was upset about it because everybody wanted to know what happened with Glenn. So I'm very curious to hear the reaction from you guys because the timing of this, I mean, that cliffhanger from the last episode was so crazy of Mark sort of in this reintegration process that's going on. And then all of a sudden, nothing. We're in a bottle episode. And normally I don't like that, but I can't help it. This episode was so good.
It's just about the quality of the work, really, where is this idea so well thought out that you're okay to wait for something more on a cliffhanger. And yeah, they like pseudo reference the cliffhanger in 10 seconds of this episode. Like it's brought up, so you're not meant to just forget about it entirely. But how I kind of think a lot about this episode in my head is, I think The Fly is a great example of this. Another one that really comes to mind for me is this big Justin Theroux spotlight of season 2 of The Leftovers, where he's kind of in a little bit of a different world and he thinks that he is sort of like this super spy who has to take people out. And that to me is my favorite episode of The Leftovers. This, I don't know if it's my favorite episode of the show yet, and that's no offense to this episode at all, because I do think
you can see yourself out.
It's phenomenal. Like, it's a beautiful, stunning, just like emotionally searing,
shocking.
Yeah, it's everything. It's just the season 1 finale is also all of those things to me, and so it's sort of, that's where I kind of am with the pinnacle of Severance right now. But I just think the guts that it took for Ben Stiller, who is somebody who, you know, a lot of us of a certain generation, we know Ben Stiller for Derek Zoolander and like 100 other really comedic roles. I will always love Dodgeball until I die, but him to do something that is this weird, this dramatic, and I mean, he directed this episode, this like well thought out, like this is an achievement. And I think it probably will be polarizing. There's probably going to be some people out here who just don't like it, who think it's too weird, but I think it's extraordinary. And I think there's a lot to unpack here. And I think we're all going to be unpacking this episode for probably months, probably even after the finale.
Yeah, even just the choice to have no opening credits for this episode, where it's just the name of the show and keeping us in that world. We were not broken from this world. Like, it was so 10 out of 10. I love this episode so much. I'm going to rewatch it an unhealthy amount of times.
Yeah, it's well worth that. We're going to try to kind of go through a lot of the things in this episode, what matters, what's sort of the meaning behind a lot of this, because I think there's a lot of symbolism. I think there's a lot of theory crafting that's going to come out of this. But first, hit that subscribe button, because we are going to continue to be here with more Severance reactions and reviews, plenty of theories as we move through this season. And if we are already at this level, can you guys imagine where we're going to be in a few weeks from now?
Yeah.
I will say this too, in general, they spent so long on this show this season, like it took years. A lot of times I would be really frustrated, but it actually feels like they have took these few years to really think about what they wanted for the show, and they've made something really, really good.
All right, let's all dive into team building and this outdoor retreat team building occurrence that we have our 4 main people in, where they're basically in like the world's biggest escape room, where they're having to follow clues and these sort of like weird AI generated versions of themselves pointing creepily to where they need to go next,
Yeah.
and how badly this team building has gone. It has not gone, it's gone from team building to team untrust with everybody so quickly. This unraveled.
Okay, this is just my first big question for everybody. Was this world real? Were they actually out in the wilderness? Because I struggled a lot with that while I was watching it, because to a certain extent, mentally, they certainly seem to think that they were. Like Helena definitely seemed to think that she was, based on that ending that we're going to get to. So I think there's a certain amount of reality where if you die in this world, or if something happens to you in this world, it affects you in another world. And I'm saying that just under the idea that maybe this isn't a real world, if you guys catch my drift. It's just the way in which we see these, artificial versions of Mark and Helly just sort of like pointing out in the distance, and the way in which it seemed like Milchick and Miss Wong kind of popped up here and there and then disappeared for a little while. It felt almost like they were NPCs at times in a video game who just showed up when they needed to give you plot points. It was so intentionally bizarre in that way.
Yeah, we had a TV that was running on no power. It was just
Yeah.
sitting at the top of a cliff. So this started to make me feel like when the Audis are going into work and we see them in the elevator, I mean,
Yeah.
everything on this show is not what it seems. The narration is very unreliable. It
Yeah.
almost feels like they're maybe at this point going into just a completely sedated state, because this still feels like it's not the severed floor, but
No.
that the severed floor, this world, all of it is just in your mind. So when you go down the elevator, you're really in just a completely sedated state. And that's why we saw Cobell a little while back driving with this like sort of incubation tube sitting in her car, where everybody who goes under is actually going under and nobody is physically actually there. This is all in their mind. Like, how else do we explain a TV with no plug, these AI figures? They can't be out in the real world. However,
Yeah.
it does still seem like in this innie world, the whole set, we'll call it the Severance innie world, that if you die here, it does affect your outie. We know
Yeah.
that from season 1 when Helly tried to do what she did, and it affected Helena out in the outie world.
Yeah, and how did they all get there? Out in the middle of the wilderness? I mean, it seems like people were on the outside watching them, which is where Irving eventually gets picked up at the end of the episode, seemingly. But I think there's a lot of these questions the show wants us to wonder about. I don't know if they want us to spend weeks thinking about that as opposed to the actual events, but it's an interesting thought experiment that apparently the idea that all of these Audis signed off supposedly on this idea of them going on this Ortbo and being out in the cold. Like, there's a lot of times in this episode you do have to wonder, okay, is Milchick just lying to them about various things, whether it be that their Audis gave permission or just little ridiculous things like, oh, this is the highest waterfall ever, when it's like, okay, well, one, Angel Falls exists. Two, are you trying to be like in terms of elevation? I don't know, but it really feels like he's trying to introduce this world of Woe's Hollow, which even just has woe in it, so that makes you think it's pretty miserable, but as though this is the most wondrous thing that these Ennies will ever see, and maybe in their limited worldview it is.
Yeah, and I think that this team building is still just to get information out of them. Like, not everybody knows Irv's experience. He had only really told Dylan, and
Yeah.
even when it sort of starts to come out a little bit about Bert, and he's really confused on how anybody knows anything, because the only person he told was Dylan, and Dylan didn't tell anybody. So it's really starting to come together for Irv that there has to be somebody from the outside on the inside. Otherwise, how do they know this stuff?
There's a lot of competing philosophies going on in the world of Lumen, and we've talked a little bit about this in some past videos as well, where it seems like we have the Kier vantage point on everything, and there are certainly people who seem to be fully down with Kier.
Yeah.
And then there are people like Milchick, who I don't think is necessarily fully down with Kier, but he has a job to do. And in this episode, I mean, his job is to clearly bring these innies around this little tour, which, my thinking is, yeah, they want to get information out of them, like you said. I think
Yep.
anytime you're sort of putting people in an outside situation where you're dealing with the elements or you're kind of away from work, you become a little bit more vulnerable. Anytime you
Yeah.
spend a lot of time with somebody, you become more vulnerable. So I think that's a part of it. But I think the other part of it is that they really think, and by that, I mean, the people who are fully on board with Kier. I've had this theory that like there's a lot of people who have Kier DNA or Kier personality traits or quote unquote Kier juice that's being passed down, and that a lot of people have little elements of Kier in them. I think that there is this idea that, oh, this will get the Annie's fully on board with the Kier cause because they can hear about this story and the sacrifice and the pain that Kier has gone through over time for the devotion of his beliefs. But because they're all so fully down in the Kier cause, they don't understand just how absurd so much of this is.
I think that Milchek and everyone else has just underestimated Irving. I think Milchek is just, he really believes that him and Irving have a deeper relationship. And I think that they did at one point
Yeah.
probably have a deeper relationship where they were, Milchek was like, I consider you my friend. I consider your
Yeah.
innie someone that I would call a friend. Like, I think we have a deeper relationship. And I think he's underestimated where Irving really is. We know that his outie has been doing these paintings and seeing things from his innie and out in his outie. We saw him on the phone saying that his message has been delivered to his innie. And my
Yeah.
theory was when Irving was left at the end of that hallway when Dylan was taken away by Miss Huang, that his outie was on the other side of that door, or someone was on the other side of that door, whether it was Cobell or Milchek or whoever's on the other side, to give him the message. And that now I'm starting to feel like the message is, don't trust everyone that's down there. Somebody is not trustworthy. I feel like that message was given to him, and that's how he really got started down this road. Now, I know there's the night gardener thing, obviously, but I
Yeah.
think that he got the message that on top of the night gardener was, don't trust everybody. Something's not right. And then he was like, oh, right, this night gardener thing, this isn't right.
We're going to try to go through a lot of the journey that Irving takes in this episode because there's some really fascinating parallels that we can think a lot about here.
Yes.
There's the incident of him not trusting Helly or Helena with the story that is being told. There is the idea that we don't know still that much about his outie, what he's really into. We know that he is very much into the idea of trying to find a way to get messages to his Annie. Like that part of this has been determined, but we also know that Irving has been around the Lumen world longer than a lot of the other Annies have. And I kind of am wondering now, and tinfoil hat, one of many we're going to have throughout this episode, but was he a part of an experiment at Lumen that didn't quite take in the same way that some of the other people did? Or does he have a little bit more of a concentrated, I don't know if I want to call this a Kier essence that's going on, but I think that there is an element, a similarity of Kier within him that is very complicated when it comes to his relationship with everyone else. Because, Milchek may think of Irving as a friend to some extent, but we've seen Irving go against Milchek in a number of different ways already. And I want to talk briefly here about the story of Dieter and how this relates to Irving. So Milchek delivers this truly bizarre story about what happens between Kier and his brother, who apparently we've never heard about before, who they've just magically saved for this very moment. I mean, we can argue whether or not Dieter really exists, though Milchek, of course, insists that this is a true story and this is all Kier's life story. But apparently in this story, Kier ends up having a vision of this person, the Timberwoe, who is extremely small, half the size of a human. And not too long after this, the incident happens with Dieter, where everything goes completely haywire.
Yeah.
We have Irving in this episode hear the story of this Timberwoe, And Helena laughs at it. And she just finds it completely absurd, which is so much more interesting now that we know 100% that this is Helena, right?
Hmm.
Irving then has this vision of he sees Bert, but he also sees this other person
Yeah.
working who is very, very small.
Yes.
Irving sees the temper low, and then Irving ends up having this incident with Helena where it almost feels like this is a certain part of like Kier punishing the person who laughed at his own tale.
Yeah, I mean, Irv really was putting things together in this episode, and it really came together for him at the campfire, where Helena says something that's pretty cruel to him about Bert,
Yeah,
basically being like, yeah, Irving's never going to see Bert again, so he's just wallowing in his loneliness and he's just going to be, sad sort of forever sort of thing. And that's the moment that really starts to come together for him. He goes out into the wilderness. He has this vision,
yeah.
Bert with the wall coming down, seeing the girl at the computer. All of those types of things are all coming together where it all really fits together with him, where he is like, Helena has never, or Helly has never been cruel to me, so you cannot be her. You have to be Helena. You are an outie. It all just comes together for him in that way. And it was really well done the way that it finally all came together, where he meets with her at this waterfall and is
Yeah.
like, I know. Like, Helly would never talk to me this way.
It's funny. A lot of people were on board really from the first episode this season that this really wasn't Helly, that
Right.
this was Helena. Like,
Yes.
it took me a little bit more time, admittedly, to get fully on board because I was kind of like, okay, is this too obvious of a twist? But I think at the end of the day, maybe the twist is a little bit obvious, but I think what makes it work is just the revelation and the way in which it gets found out, where I don't think there's even a competition anymore for best supporting actor. I think John Turturro won it in this episode, and I think it's already just a done deal. Nobody else can even submit because it was so powerful and emotional and devastating, and it kind of came together a lot quicker than I really expected it to. But yeah, I think a lot of this is stemming from the things that Helena did, Helena said in this episode, a
Mhm.
little bit of doubt in his mind.
Yeah, I also
Yeah,
think that it is what you said about Dieter. Is this story actually true? Because if it is, Helena probably should have heard this story already. She
yeah,
should know what this is. So for her to have that kind of a reaction, it feels like it's like, oh, here's this magical appendix that's come up, number 4, where there's this Dieter character, and all of a sudden everybody's like, what? What is it? Like, and I think she's laughing because well, one, it's so ridiculous, but two, she hasn't heard it before, which doesn't make any sense. It has to be made up.
yeah. I think it probably is made up. I think it just shows further that there are certain parts of everything Lumen is doing that Helena herself finds to be particularly absurd. But I think this also kind of shows further, perhaps, this contrast between people at Lumen who are pro Kier and everything about Kier. Like, I think if you say this story to Miss Cobell, I don't think Cobell is going to be laughing at this story at all. Like, she seems to be fully down with the Kier cause, no matter what this company seems to do with her. But then there's these other people who seem to be viewing things very differently. Like, it's no coincidence that we saw the reaction we did by Milchick and he put the really horrible paintings away. Like, it's there's clearly differences of opinions and cracks within this company, and it's just interesting to kind of see them come out in this way where, yeah, Milchick's not laughing in this instance, but that doesn't mean that Milchick believes it. He's just a guy doing his job, and I think it's more important to note now than ever that he knew this whole time that this was Helena and not Helly
Mm-hmm.
in this world. So he was probably even more in his head. It's sort of like you're doing a job at the office and you know that the office boss is there and they're not always there. So it's like, well, I guess I can't, check my fantasy football today, or, oh, I can't spend, 2 hours in the break room making an extra coffee. It's like you're working harder.
Yeah, I mean, Milchick really is trying to hold it together the best that he can. I
Yeah.
mean, even we saw Natalie break a little bit when she gave those paintings to him. Like,
Yeah.
the beginning of it was her face not smiling, and watching her try to like paste that smile on her face because
Yeah.
she knew that the board was paying attention to try to smile her way through those offensive paintings.
Yeah.
They know that they have to play a certain game because the board is always watching.
Yeah, they do. And that's why we're going to be set up. But maybe by the end of the season, maybe this is a season 3 thing where everything at Lumen potentially ends up falling apart and we see characters really work in order to take sides. But this is where it does get interesting with Irving, because I think
Mhm.
it's easy to assume coming out of all this that, okay, Milchick has completely ripped Irving a new one, given this whole powerful speech. You will never be remembered. Your innie is going to be destroyed.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like his innie and his outie, like he's just going to be completely not remembered. And that's where, like we're talking a little bit in the last video,
Yeah.
I feel like the outie world isn't entirely real either. There's something very weird about it. Like we have real phone booths from like the 80s and the 90s. All the cars look like they're from the 90s, stuck in like a time warp, but people are using current cell phones. Like something is really weird about that outie world as well. And hearing Milchick say, you are not going to be remembered. Your innie is going to be forgotten. Your outie is going to be forgotten.
Yeah.
You are just going to not exist anymore. It made me feel like, yeah, the outie world, the innie world, it's all just the same.
I think whatever world Irving is going to find himself in after this, I definitely do not think this is the last time we're going to see John Turturro on this show. Like, I will make that very, very clear.
I really hope you're right, because this is going to be so miserable without him.
No, I just think he's too good a character. He's too good an actor. I think there's a lot of loose ends that still need to be tied up. But I think that the most important thing here is that Audi Irving was already intent on trying to find ways to get answers as to what was going on in the any world. I just think this, unless they like find a way to completely, I don't know, Men in Black wipe his brain entirely, which, you know, who knows with this world, but I think because he's already been experimenting so much with the subconscious already, to the point where he's like trying to stay up as long as possible to implant thoughts into his innie and all this other stuff, he's gonna know that something is awry and he's gonna work in order to try to find a way to stop it. And plus, beyond all this, like, let's say that there is an element of cure in Irving that is perhaps more pronounced than anybody else out there. I'm sure the board watch this whole bow and whatever way in which they're gonna do that, and maybe they're like, oh, there is something to Irving that's very important. And why did Helena laugh at this? I think that they're still going to find a use for Irving, and he's still going to have some sort of purpose. I'm not saying he's going to end up on the same side as everyone else, because this show is really complicated, but this is not the end of him. I just can't believe that.
I just don't know how the board or Milchick or anybody else really is able to deal with this now, because now Mark and Dylan also know that Helena was down there. She called out to Seth, you know, change it out, bring her back, get me out of here. Like, everybody knows what the score is.
Yeah.
So even Milchick coming down being like, you're fired, no one's ever going to remember you, you're going to disappear. It's like, okay, but Dylan and Mark know what's going on. Helly doesn't know what's going on because she wasn't there, but these two know what's going on. So how do you deal with that?
That is where I think this is all going to come down to Mark. And Mark is in a very fascinating position coming out of this episode.
Yeah.
He spends all this time with Helena, and it's hard to really pin down, like, okay, how much time has this group of innies, including Helena, really spent together?
Yeah.
But he did go on this whole mission with Helena that ended up, you know, heading over to mammalians and seeing the goats. And, you know, she has worked in order to try to help him find Gemma, or at least that's his preconceived notion. But she's also been relatively kind to him, understanding to him. They, you know, they are together in this episode.
Yeah.
And even after they're together, in one of, I think, the most vulnerable moment we've ever seen Helena, she basically says to him that she is ashamed, that it is that embarrassment that's kind of keeping her from telling the truth about her outie self. So clearly she is struggling a lot with this, and he told her that it doesn't matter what happened on the outside. So does he still believe this now? Like, it's one thing to say this, it's another thing to hear, oh, you actually aren't who I thought you were, and you actually are in Egan. How do I feel about this? I don't think he's going to abandon her, though. That's not who Mark is.
No, I think now that they've been intimate together and he
Yeah.
did say it doesn't matter who you are on the outside, and if that's true, then he's still gonna want to be with her. It just makes this even more complicated because it was kind of like, okay, his innie is with Helly
Yeah.
and his outie is with Gemma. Now his innie is also with Helena, who's an outie. Like it makes it so complicated of who his heart is really going to be with in all of this.
It is the weirdest love triangle of all time. Like, I feel pretty confident when I say that, mostly just because we don't know how Severance is going to end. But if Mark in the Audi world ever decides he just wants to shut down his indie forever, like, that ends this relationship in a weird way.
Yeah, if he's able to. I mean, is this outie world really the regular world or not? I really don't know at this point, but what I do know is one of my favorite parts of this whole episode was watching those
I
marshmallows.
knew you were
Oh
going to say
my
this.
goodness, story time. So I always get 2 bags of marshmallows whenever I'm like camping and I'm
Mhm.
doing like s'mores and stuff. And one is for s'mores
Yeah.
and one is just to throw them into the fire because
What?
I love watching it bubble over like a science experiment. I just loved watching Kier's face and it all bubbling over. Anyone else do that? No,
You
just
can't,
me.
no, you can't make the marshmallows. No, I mean, here's my problem though. I have mild cerebral palsy, so I have really shaky hands. So I'm always very nervous anytime that I try to cook a marshmallow over a fire, that I'm gonna like shake and it's gonna fall in the fire, and then I'm gonna lose my stick, then I'm gonna lose my everything. I am the worst marshmallow roaster of all time. Like, that's the one thing I can say, at least with some measure of confidence there. Now, okay, one thing I do want to talk about with Mark and Helena is just that we did have that brief moment of the two of them were together.
Yes.
Mark has this little flash, this
Mhm.
reintegration flash, if you will, and he sees Gemma. And I think the big question I had coming into this, and I was so immersed at the time we got to this that I wasn't actively thinking about it anymore, but it was, okay, is Mark just fully in a spot now where he is both innie and outie Mark at the same time? Does he remember all of this? But just watching that, it kind of made me feel like, okay, he's working to reintegrate himself, but
Yes.
this process is not anywhere near complete yet. But a lot of this is about still the subconscious, which is why Irving has worked so much of this in the outside world, trying to get messages to the inside. And I think Audi Mark, because one of his big driving forces and the most devastating thing to him is Gemma, that it's no coincidence that it's when Annie Mark is being intimate, that's the moment when his subconscious kind of fights back on it to a certain extent.
Yeah, I mean, it's also going to be interesting to see Helena in the outside world now that she has had this moment with Mark. I
Yeah.
mean, her access to Mark now is outie Mark. So, does she find a way to be able to connect with him out there? I think this was the most vulnerable we've seen Helena, where
Yeah.
she did say that she doesn't like who she is, on the outside. She is having problems with that. I think that she had come in very specifically after she saw that her innie is having a romantic relationship and making a real connection with Mark. I think what she said,
Mhm.
oh, my outie is just alone in her, house by herself in her jogging pants, living a lonely life. I think
Yeah.
that's true. I think she is that way. It's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Yeah, she comes across, definitely to me anyway, way more sympathetic in this episode than we have ever seen Helena before on this show.
Yes and no. I mean, yes, she comes across as sympathetic in that way. No, because Mark doesn't know who he's going to bed with. And that's not okay under any circumstances. Like, he thinks he's going to bed with Helly, the innie, the person that he's falling for, that he's He's like, I can make googly eyes at anybody I want, and I want to make them at you. You and I have this connection. And she is not Helly at this point. And I know that there'll be the argument of like, well, they are kind of the same person, but they're kind of not. You know what I mean? We've got Helena Egan, who is somebody who is running this company and running these experiments. And then you have Helly, who is not that person. And Mark thought he was being with Helly, and he was being lied to, where he was going to bed with somebody who was not Helly.
It's so complicated because I agree with where you're coming from, that this is something where she should say this. I think she in her head is in a really tight spot where I think she's scared, and it's not something, I don't know if Helena will ever even admit to this, where she's scared about the judgment that comes with her name, and that if she says she's Helena, what's going to happen to her with these other people, because I think this is one of the few times she's ever made a connection with somebody. It's a really delicate line that the show is walking here, mostly because this is a world and an idea that's not really brought up on shows in general. They are different people. I think what we're getting at in this episode, and really I think this season, is this idea that Helena and Helly are a little bit more alike than Helena probably wishes to admit or even tries to think about in some ways. There's a reason why Helly, the Annie, is as rebellious as she is. And I think it's because of those like subconscious ingrained traits. And that's what makes her want to tell Mark the truth, but she's still not getting there, which is why, he's probably in a pretty emotionally devastated spot now.
Well, how do you tell somebody that after you've just gone to bed with them, to be like, by the way, I know you thought you just went to bed with Helly, but actually I'm Helena. Like, there's no way to really get around that. How do you say that?
Yeah,
she shouldn't have done it. It's not right.
No, she shouldn't have done it. I think she's desperate for vulnerability. She's desperate to find a connection. Like, I understand that part of it. She still should not have done that. I feel for her as a character because I think she's probably been trapped for a huge part of her life. I don't know if there's anything even within this episode that's going to change any of it, just because we don't know how you're managing to put the toothpaste back in the tube here. But one thing we've kind of learned now from Severance through the end of season 1, moving into season 2, is they always find a way. I did not think there was any universe where they were going to be able to kind of reestablish a norm after the events of the finale. And they did that. So I think they will try to find a way to get these Annies back at work, because Cold Harbor is still not done. Like, we have not heard anything suggesting that.
No, I am so curious about this next episode. I do not know how they get Dylan and Mark especially back to work after this, knowing that Helena was down there, knowing that she's an Egan, knowing that Irv is gone. Like, how does any of this work anymore? It's really maybe going to be up to Helly, now that she's back, to come in, be honest with them, and be like, together we're going to figure it out to pull them back in. Like, Mildred's not going to be able to pull them back in.
No.
I mean, it's going to be extremely difficult at this point. I don't know how they do it. How do they steer the ship after this?
I'm just so excited to find out, because I just love the risk taking with this show so much. This episode is meant to make you have conversations about identity, what's real, what's not, what matters in your life. Are there certain fates that you are destined to have to deal with? There's just a lot of really big picture stuff, but then there's just also the who really wants to go on a corporate retreat in like the middle of the winter in freezing cold temperatures. I don't like camping ever. Like, I would not want to be out there doing this in any shape or form, let alone this weather. I mean, sure, the tent seemed like they had heating, but even still.
No, I don't want to sleep on the ground. Like, I've gone camping, and the best part is the marshmallows. I am not interested in sleeping on the ground. I want to sleep outside. I'm really soft. I want to stay inside.
I know.
And these corporate retreats or like team building, I used to work in finance, and they would have that stuff all the time of like, oh, we're all going axe throwing or whatever. And I'm just like, can I just go home? Like, I am with you guys all day long, 40 hours a week. I want to go home. I want to see my family. I want to see my dog. I want to see my bunny. I want to do anything else but continue to have more work time.
I think to a certain extent, all this, big theoretical stuff aside, what this show is really doing here is reflecting on, let's create the worst version of this thing that people who are watching our show have probably experienced, just so that they can find a way to relate to us on a different level.
Yeah.
I really love this episode. I really hope you guys enjoyed it as much as we did. We'll see exactly where we go from here.
Yep.
But be sure to hit that subscribe button so you guys do not miss anything more we have coming on Severance, reactions, reviews, theories, so much more. You can support us further by joining our Patreon. That link is in the description below. We're covering there exclusively Prime Target. And if you already have Apple TV, you might as well watch it too. It's really, really fun.
Yeah.
And also covering The Pit on Max. Thank you guys so much. We'll see you here next time.